Hi, I'm JP, you're watching the Coffee Channel, and today we're going to be reviewing this little device. It's called the Tricolate. It's a filter coffee brewer that shares some of the qualities of an AeroPress and some of the qualities of a pour-over device. The main difference is that it is a zero bypass device. Now, what do I mean by that? Well, all of the water that goes through the filter and through the coffee has to go through the coffee. There's no water coming down the sides like it does on a V60 or on a Chemex or something like that. So it shares that quality with an AeroPress. How does it differ from an AeroPress? Well, the main difference is you're not producing pressure on it to push the coffee through. You're letting gravity do the work. What it does allow, apparently according to the manufacturers and to some baristas I've spoken to about this, is a much higher extraction rate than other coffees. If we can get a high extraction rate without making the coffee taste bad, then we can actually get a more interesting, flavourful coffee. And something like the AeroPress has a problem that when we're pushing down and pushing the coffee through, we can sometimes force the water in the coffee through the edges of the filter because we're using too much force, we ground too fine. So we end up with getting kind of unfiltered coffee through there, and you get grounds in your coffee and it just doesn't taste that good. Whereas with this, you're relying on gravity. The downside is it's probably going to be a bit slower. Let's make some coffee and see what it tastes like. The filter paper itself is a very precision German-made paper with very, very fine holes in it.
Hello, it is me, Tricolate filter paper. Sometimes I am wet and sometimes I am dry.
It fits exactly into the space here. Now it takes a bit of practice to get it in and actually right up to the edges. But once you make sure it's totally flat and there's no chance of it coming out the side, we'll put it on top of our vessel and then we're going to add coffee. So the recipe that they suggest is actually a very low ratio recipe in terms of the amount of coffee to the amount of water. So we're talking 1 to 20 here. So I'm going to use about 10 grams of coffee and about 200 grams of water. Now, this actually isn't that far from a sort of AeroPress recipe that I do. I probably use about 11 or 12 grams of coffee to about 200 grams of water. So it's not that different from what I've done in the past. But a lot of people with pour-over coffees tend to use quite a lot of coffee. Now, when you use more coffee, you actually decrease the ability of the coffee to be extracted by the water. The more coffee that's in there, although it seems counterintuitive, the harder it is for the water to extract from the coffee. So when we're using a small amount with a very fine grind, we should be able to get a really high extraction. And if you're using something like the EK, you can always go a bit lower on these kind of coffees, go a bit finer, go lower with the dose, finer with the grind. So grind wise, I've gone for about 2.1 for this filter roast Kelowna coffee that I'm using, and that isn't far off what I'd use for an espresso. So an Ethiopian espresso I may come in at 1.9. This is an Ethiopian filter coffee, I'm going at 2.1. So it's really quite fine, much finer than you typically make a V60 or a Chemex with. So we're going to put that in. And we're going to make sure we've got a nice, decent, flattish coffee bed. You're never going to get it perfect. And then we're going to get ready to add our water. Now, this is BPA free, this plastic, so it's not going to cause any problems with hot water. You know, there's no problems with this biphenyls or whatever they're called, but it does cool the water somewhat. It's better than other types of plastics, but you're always going to get quite a bit of cooling. So the manufacturers recommend you actually use boiling water rather than the sort of 94 to 96 degree water that we usually use in pour overs. So I'm going to do that now, and that will allow for some of the cooling because it's quite a long brewing time. Now what I'm going to do is I'm going to add 50 grams, and I'm going to start the timer. I'm going to add 50 grams to do the bloom. and you'll notice that the shower screen here is nicely dispersing the coffee, and you can add it in all at once. Now, next thing is we notice that some of this coffee around the edges here hasn't got entirely wetted yet, so we're going to give it a shake like this to get that working and to get the water dispersed throughout all of the coffee. Now I'm going to give that 30 seconds. So I'm now going to add the rest of the water, which is 150 grams of water. And you don't need to worry about pouring in any particular rate. It's not like a pour over. You just add it in all at once. The shower screen will do its business, and then you just give it a good shake again to kind of stir it up, and then you just let it extract. Now, the extraction time can be anything up to 7 or 8 minutes, so this isn't a quick coffee to make. We'll see how long this particular one takes with a fairly fine grind, but I'm pretty sure it's going to be at least 5 minutes. So if you're someone who needs their coffee really quickly, I'd still suggest going for the AeroPress. If you're prepared to wait, then the results should be slightly better than the AeroPress, but the proof is in the pudding, so we'll see how we go. In terms of costs, they come in around £50. They might be slightly cheaper or more expensive in other parts of the world, but that's about how much they are. That includes 100 filters. The filters themselves are not standard filters, so the only problem is you'll have to keep buying them from the company that supplies them in your area. So they're Tricolate specific filters. You can't use an AeroPress filter or anything like that. So they will be a bit more expensive. So it's not a cheap way of making coffee, but I've heard very good things about this. My initial tryouts with it have given some pretty good results. So if you're after kind of the best tasting coffee and not too worried about costs, then seems to be a good brewer for you. If you like the action of the kind of pouring over, the kind of pouring over a little bit and letting it bloom, then pouring a bit more, that sort of stuff, then this maybe isn't for you. You don't have that kind of ritual with it. It's a very simple method. There's no kind of skill that you can impart into it, but that should make it a bit more consistent than a pour over. In fact, it should be a bit more consistent than AeroPress, where it's almost impossible to produce the same amount of pressure every time, and as I said before, you sometimes end up pushing a bit too hard and getting the coffee coming out the side of the filter. This should be pretty consistent every time, but it is a little bit slow, and it's not going to produce a boiling hot drink at the end of it. Now, I would never recommend drinking a coffee super hot anyway. I think that it tastes best below about 50 degrees C, and it tastes significantly better at lower temperatures than that. But if you're one of these strange people who really likes to drink boiling hot coffee, then this isn't going to be the brewer for you either. Now, we've gone 3.5 minutes now. It's kind of almost finished here. You may wonder why I'm using a glass rather than some sort of other receptacle like a jug. It's just because I left my jug at home and forgot to bring it in today. So normally you'd use maybe a V60 jug or something on that, as it's a bit prettier. But this works perfectly fine as long as you're not making too much coffee. I should add at this point, you can also use this to make a more traditional style pour over coffee. So you could quite easily grind a lot coarser and use a bit more water and make a 300ml drink with sort of 20 grams of coffee maybe, and get a bit of a more full-bodied flavour, but it kind of defeats the object of this particular brewer. I don't think it will do anything particularly better than using a pour over for that, but it does mean that it's a bit more versatile than something like an AeroPress, which can really only make one coffee at once. At a push, you could get 400 mils in here with 20 grams of coffee and make a coffee that's very similar to the one that I'm making now in terms of high extraction, but is enough just about for 2 people. So maybe that's something that a coffee shop would find useful, that you can make 2 coffees at once without having to sort of look at it the whole time and mess around with it. You could just leave it there, or perhaps you could even take it to the customer themselves and let it drip through. That's one possibility. Now, when I spoke about it being the no bypass, if you think about a conical filter like a V60, a lot of the water is actually going down the side and into the coffee and not actually going through the coffee itself. Because this is a straight down like an AeroPress, there's nowhere for that water to go. Now, some people are doing wacky things with the AeroPress and adding water as kind of bypass themselves in competitions. This to me seems absolutely nonsense. You use the actual brewer for the purpose it was designed for. Use the advantages that it has. Don't try and make it like another brewer. Use it for what it's designed to be used for. You can make some amendments, but only if they make it taste better. And to be honest, I don't see how adding bypass water to a coffee that's made with a non-bypass method is going to make it taste any better. It's absolute nonsense. So please don't try and do that with this. You may as well buy yourself a V60 or a Chemex. It's completely pointless. So we're getting towards the end of the extraction now. We're talking about, so this has been about 6 minutes. Now what I have noticed is that the last bit of the extraction takes a very long time. So you're often left with quite a bit of water just kind of not really doing a lot, sort of sitting at the top of the coffee bed. That's just part of the experience, unfortunately. And another part of it, also unfortunately, and this is where it kind of loses out a little bit to me in terms of whether I'd use it in a coffee shop environment. Unlike the AeroPress, it isn't really self-cleaning. So with the AeroPress, once you've pushed the coffee through, you kind of put the puck in the bin or in your compostable waste, kind of clean the filter if you've got a metal filter, or throw away the paper filter, and then it's ready to go again. Whereas with this, there's kind of bits of coffee left in all sorts of crevices. It's got little bits that are really quite hard to clean because of the nature of the design. So it's not really ideal in that respect. If you're in a coffee shop, you really have to have multiple ones of these because cleaning it does take a bit of time. So whereas I got away with in my coffee shop having 2 AeroPresses, I could easily make enough filter coffee using just those 2, even if I was fairly busy. You need probably 4 or 5 of these if you're expecting to do several filters. So we're almost getting towards the end here. I think I'm gonna actually leave this here. We're gonna lose a little bit of the extraction, but I think we might be waiting a long time for this last bit of water to get through the coffee grounds. So I'm gonna take it off, put it on my receptacle. What we've got is actually something that looks a bit like Coke. It's quite a dark colour. Seems slightly darker than some of the coffees I've made by filter methods, but holding up to the light, it goes a nice sort of reddish tinge. Now what I'm expecting from this coffee is kind of a low TDS, a low bodied coffee, but with loads of fruitiness, loads of upfront flavours, loads of complexity. Let's have a sip. Okay, so interestingly, it's a bit hotter than I expected. It hasn't cooled by as much, probably because we used boiling water. So even though it's 6 or 7 minutes extraction time, it's just about ready to drink now. In fact, I'd say it's almost slightly too hot to be ideal. As it cools a bit, we'll see a few more flavours as it opens up. Let's try again. Okay, so it's a very delicate coffee. That low TDS, that low strength, helps it to bring out more of the subtle flavours, so you're not being overwhelmed with the strength of the coffee. I'd say if I were to make this again, I would probably dose up a little bit. I think that a better ratio would probably be about 12 grams of coffee to 200 grams of water. I think this tastes a little bit weak for my liking, and I'm not a fan of high TDS coffees, especially espresso and filter. I just think that you can get more subtleties from a lower TDS coffee. Let's try a bit more. Okay, so as it's cooled a little bit in the time we've been talking, I'm getting kind of plummy flavours, a bit of sort of damson, a little bit of booziness from the natural element of the coffee itself, but not overpowering. It's a really easy coffee to drink. It's kind of floral as well, and I think this has brought that out much more than maybe other methods would. Also, I think it will be much more consistent in the long run, as long as you keep all your ratios the same, your times the same, your grind the same, blah blah blah. Okay, so to sum up, I think it's actually a pretty good device to add to your repertoire of filter coffee methods. I would use it in a coffee shop, although I would buy multiple ones. I think you could definitely make 2 coffees at once with this, which gives it a bit of an advantage over the AeroPress, which is a fair bit cheaper. It's a bit messy, but for home use, it doesn't really matter that much, and you can make a couple of coffees for home use as well at the same time. So overall, a pretty good device. Now, we're going to be using it over the next few months. We're going to come back with a more long-term review because we've only made a few coffees with it so far. So obviously, as you use it more and more, you get to learn its kind of foibles and things that make it better or worse. I think that we can probably get some really good coffees out of it, but we'll be coming back in the future with some recipes. Any ideas that you have, please drop us a line in the comment section below. Any thoughts you have about it? Have you bought one of these? Do you like it? Do you dislike it? Let us know in the comments. For now, bye.